Hey everyone, welcome to this AZ-801 course, which is titled Configuring Windows Server Hybrid Advanced Services. My name is Peter de Tender, and I'm a Microsoft Technical Trainer here at Microsoft. I'll start with a course overview, where this course has a total of 9 different modules. Now, if you just quickly look at this overview first slide, you always see on-premises being highlighted, and then the follow-up module is highlighting hybrid infrastructure. So what's the scenario? We always start with the focus point on the Windows Server operating system capabilities, assuming that it's primarily running in your on-premises data center. But then the follow-up module covers, obviously, running the same Windows Server operating system in an Azure virtual machine environment, but then specifically touching on hybrid capabilities. To allow you, as you can see in the first 2 modules, we're going to focus on some security capabilities. So the idea there is, in the first module, it's primarily Windows Server. You could almost say no matter where it's actually running, we're going to focus on the security part. And then in the follow-up module, it's highlighting security using Azure capabilities to optimize the security in that operating system virtual machine environment. Module 3 will touch on Windows Server high availability, where, as you can see, there's no split up between on-premises and hybrid. The main idea in that module is covering how to deploy your high available clusters out of the Windows operating system. Modules 4 and 5 are zooming in on disaster recovery, how to build not only your high available operating system environment out of Module 3, but what happens during a disaster, and even better, how to protect yourself from disasters. Where then in Module 5, it's mainly zooming in on how to use Azure Cloud Services to help in your disaster recovery scenario. Moving on with Module 6 and 7, it's all about how to upgrade and migrate your Windows Server environments, where the on-prem scenario could be migrating from one operating system to another, like maybe shifting versions, but also maybe migrating to virtual machine environments if you're still running Windows Server in a physical scenario. Then in Module 7, it's how to migrate your server running workloads from on-prem to a cloud Azure virtual machine. And then Modules 8 and 9, we're going to wrap it up and focusing on troubleshooting by using monitoring capabilities. Initially out of Module 8, using the built-in server monitoring capabilities. And then last with Module 9, how to use Azure available monitoring troubleshooting scenarios to monitor and troubleshoot your Azure virtual machines in there. I'll start a bit with introducing myself. Now, you might go like, wait a minute, Peter, didn't you publish like a lot of Azure AI topics lately? If you follow us on Microsoft Learn or you go to our YouTube channel, then yes, indeed, over the last few weeks and months, I did a lot of recordings around Azure AI. So why am I pulled in to now talk about Windows Server, which I guess, as you can imagine, is quite a big stretch from AI on one end all the way to Windows Server. Now, I've been around the IT industry for close to 30 years, which means that actually for me, like 29 years ago, summer 96, I actually started as a technical engineer building or helping building physical data centers. So literally the power, the cabling, the cooling. And then throughout my first years in my career, I was gradually moving up in the data center stack. So I did server implementations, but before that did firewall, network switches, all that fun stuff. And then eventually bumped into the server platform, deploying different physical server brands out of the partner I was working for, where the operating system version at that time was Windows NT4 Server. I can imagine that maybe even for some of you, you might not even have been born in the year 96. So that's where I actually like to describe this as going back to what got me really into my IT career. I've been a server admin as a consultant, as a trainer for probably more than 20 years in my career. And my shift into the Azure platform happened in the early days of Azure, but it was still deploying virtual machines. So that's where you still have that touching point on running servers, whether it's on-prem, whether you move them to cloud. In the end, a lot of it is still depending on your operating system, which means you need to be able to manage your server. And I guess that's really the big reason why you're watching this course as well. Apart from that, as you can see, I spent quite some free time writing technical books, but I now call them Azure History because the most up-to-date one is already 4 years old. But I just wanted to share it. It also explains a bit where my Azure architect interest comes in. Did a lot of DevOps, and then out of the Microsoft trainer role that I've been in the role for 6 years now as a full-time trainer here at Microsoft, gradually shifted through architecting over DevOps into app modernization. And that's where now, I would say for the last couple of months, AI and Copilot was obviously top of mind. You got my contact details here on the slide as well. I would say feel free to reach out, stay in touch, send me an email, ping me on Teams, connect on LinkedIn. If you have any questions, if you want to share feedback about the course, more than happy to try and help you out. The other part about learning, it's just obviously not just about learning technology, but also maybe a lot of you are looking into getting certified, which is something that I always try to motivate any of my learners in any classes and trainings I'm doing, like just get certified. Why? Because first of all, it's so cool for yourself to know that you know your technology, but it might also help you throughout your career by keeping up your skills. Now, specifically for the topic of this course, we actually have two different options. So this is AZ-801, but we also have the exam AZ-800 and obviously linked to the course AZ-800. And that one is administering Windows Server hybrid core infrastructure. So I would simplify this as it's primarily focusing on managing the Windows operating system and not too much on the Azure integration side. Where then second, you can take this course and obviously later on taking this exam, and that's the one for 801. Now, ultimately, you take one exam, you take the second one, and you got the credential for passing that exam. But if you combine those two, you get actually an associate level certification credential, and that's going to give you the title Windows Server Hybrid Administrator Associate. And as you can see, there's a little side note here where you can actually choose the order in which you're going to take the exams. So my recommendation here would be, depending on what your job role might be like today, if you're still primarily working with on-prem servers, I would assume that taking the Azure 800 exam might be a little bit easier, where on the other side, if you're already doing quite a lot with virtual machines in Azure, then maybe starting with that 801 could be beneficial. But ultimately, I would recommend to take the two exams and then getting that associate level credential. Now, one way to get there is obviously going through the different modules we have. So you should aim for about 10 hours in total, but each and every module will be separate, so you can decide whenever you want to go through them. Obviously, next to that, just watching videos, I would say, is probably not giving you all that experience that you need in your day-to-day job, and obviously also not to get you through the exam. Why not? Because you really need that practice hands-on experience. Now, how can you get there out of our Learn package? I would say, first of all, obviously, get access to an Azure subscription. Now, if you go like, well, I'm maybe not having access to an Azure subscription out of the organization I'm working for, just know that you can sign up for a free Azure subscription. So you go to azure.microsoft.com/free, you create a Microsoft account, and from there, you can activate one. Next to that, we do have all the labs that we use in our in-person or even virtual classes, but not the recorded videos, right? Where all those lab instructions are open sourced on GitHub. So you got the link here. I'm not going to read from it, but you got the link here. I would say just open it up, go through the different instructions. But you know what? I'm actually going to bring in a little demo to show you how you can register for that free Azure subscription, and then quickly walking you through that GitHub repo as well. Just giving you all starting point information that you need to just make this a fun ride. That's the main thing. So if you should not have an Azure account, you might be able to go to our Azure homepage and creating a free account from there. So as mentioned in the presentation, the shortcut link is azure.microsoft.com/free. And then from there, it's going to redirect you, where then you select Try Azure for free. The idea here is to provide your personal contact details where you need to sign in with a personal account. So as you can see in my scenario here, in my browser, I was automatically authenticated using my corporate account, and that would not be allowed. So make sure you go for personal Microsoft account. And by the way, if you don't have one, you can create one from account.microsoft.com. Next to that, the other interesting page here is our lab guides for the Azure 801 course, where quite a lot of my demos, I would say, are reflecting some of or several of the steps that we're going to walk through in these labs, but they're not 100% identical. So that's where you could benefit from watching the video, going through my demo scenarios, and then obviously also spending quite some time on your own going through these labs. So what we have here, it's all 100% open source. And you would go into instructions and labs, and then you're going to find two different scenarios. So what do I mean by that is the first set of links are just providing instructions. Now, not all those instructions are step-by-step instructions. That's where you could move to the second option here, and that's the lab guides with a key, and that stands for answer key. So just depending a bit on your experience level, you could go through the labs with already quite some experience out of your day-to-day job, or if you're totally new to the topic, or you're just struggling a little bit with some of the instructions, that's where you could look into the answer key option. And then from here, it's obviously just looping through. Now, obviously, you're going to see that every now and then it's pointing to server names. Now, these are just examples. So the idea is that since we're talking about Windows Server, you're probably going to deploy a couple of different Windows servers in your own environment, where obviously the naming convention could be totally different. But wanted to share that as a good starting point, that for you, besides watching through all the course videos and seeing my demos in action, you could actually go through a full series of hands-on labs for you as well. So with that, I would say welcome to this specific module, where it's all about securing Windows Server on-premises and hybrid infrastructure, where, as you remember from the introduction, we always got two modules touching on the same concept, and this one is primarily focusing on Windows Server security, which means looking into the operating system, and you could almost forget that it's not all that important where you're actually running that Windows Server environment. Out of this module, we have three different sections. The first one, I assume pretty obvious, talking about how to secure Windows Server user accounts, followed by how to hardening, really securing, protecting the Windows Server environment itself, and then last touching a little bit on Windows Server update management. So with that, I would say, let's get started. Now, when you think about securing Windows Server user accounts, there's a lot of different things probably coming to mind. So this is just a listing of the main topics I'll touch on throughout this first section. We're going to start with configuring user account rights, a little bit on security options, and talking about password policies. From there, we're going to touch on protecting user accounts and then implementing different Defender security mechanisms in the platform. One outsider, maybe some of you go like, what is blocking NTLM authentication? It's actually a little bit, I would say, historical. Remember, I talked about my experience like 30 years ago, NT4 server, so that's a bit where that authentication protocol came in. But if you have a newer operating system like Server 2025 that I'll use throughout all my demos, you don't really have to worry about NTLM. And it's not even just 2025. If your operating system servers and clients are pretty up to date, I would say anything that's like the last 10, 15 years old, then you should be good to go to actually block it. But that's a quite important one because it also means that it's a big step up in securing your Windows Server operating system. Next, we're going to talk a bit about problematic accounts. Think about the ones that are still there, still active, but not really being used. And that means you need to do some administrative cleanup. And then closing this section with different Defender mechanism solutions in the operating system, talking a bit about Windows Server, Defender application control, talking about Defender for endpoints, and Defender Smart Screen that's protecting your browser experience. Pretty long list, so I'm going to jump in straight away. The first part is, what does it mean to configure user account rights? Now, if you think about how users, administrators, but basically any kind of user are interacting with the operating system, it starts with authentication. Like, you cannot use your device if you are not authenticating, which now also means that you need to bring in the correct settings in your operating system to make sure that the correct user can authenticate. But it also means that you need to be able to block off users from authenticating to your server environment. On top of that, once the user can authenticate, it's also important to bring in a concept that we describe as least privilege. What it means is, give your admin users only the specific admin privilege that they need to do to perform their tasks. You don't need to be a full admin every single day for the whole day to perform server tasks. There's a lot of server tasks that don't require full administrative permissions. And that's mainly what I want to highlight here. Next to that, obviously, there's a lot of options to go through. It all depends on what your server environment looks like. But the main message here is, look into group policies. Now, I'm not going to zoom in on group policies too much. Remember, this is AZ-801, mainly touching on some of the server aspects, but mainly hybrid. If you're a little bit new into group policies, then I would definitely recommend going back to the group policy module in AZ-800. So this is just a screenshot, but you can imagine whenever you see a screenshot coming up, that typically means like, ooh, there's actually a demo that Peter's gonna bring in as well. So this is just a screenshot. On the left side, we do have our user account rights permissions in the group policy viewer. And on the right-hand side, it's a view on the individual user object, like an identity object in Active Directory, where you can also define security settings, like, is the account enabled or disabled? What are the password policies? Although you should also do that from group policy settings, because a lot of that is not always specifically to one single identity object, but probably valid for a series of accounts, like a group scenario, or maybe even for a full organizational unit. Next to that, you can continue working in your group policies, where you're going to touch on specific security policy settings. Now, what are security policy settings? It's a collection of rules, and there's like maybe 400, 500 or more settings you can enable or disable, and then targeting them, allocating them, assigning them if you want to different individual computers or overall devices, and try to split up, I would say, the difference between servers and clients. You could go all the way to specific client operating systems, specific server operating systems, but again, I won't go all that deep in just positioning the topic. Just know for now that you do have a full section on configuring security options within the group policies. The next option is the configuration of password policies. So what this means is that, as I mentioned like a minute ago, you can define individual password policy settings for each and every individual user account. But again, that's just making it hard. It's not really about the size of your environment, but imagine that you have 5 servers to manage. You have 200 users, maybe 20 of them are administrative accounts. It could already mean that your password policies or password complexity could be varied based on the user type, based on the admin type of the user, as well as the client and server operating system. So what you can do here is, once more, go back to your group policies, defining the correct permissions for your users. And then you might think like, wait a minute, isn't this just pretty generic? Like, I can define a password expiration, like as a user, we need to, I don't know, reset the password or change passwords every 30 days, maybe every 60, 90 days, whatever number of days that works for your environment. Or maybe for some users, you might opt in to maybe not allow them to reset the passwords. And then for some other ones, you might come up with a totally different scenario. And next to that, you also have what I call the outsider accounts, and that's the protect user account using protected users group in Active Directory. So when a user is a member of this protected users group, like a specific group in Active Directory, it means that apart from the password policies and other security mechanisms that I briefly highlighted before, you're now moving this into some sort of a specific, maybe some sort of an exclusive group, and that's what we call protected users. So just a couple of highlights here without reading each and every bullet point, but if you need a bit more time, I would say just click the pause button and you can spend as much time as you want in reading through all those options. But for example, a quite important one is the first one here: user credentials are not getting cached locally. So that means that you need to be online, you need to have that Active Directory domain controller direct interaction to validate the user account credentials. Next to that, another one that I actually like is the user can no longer sign in offline. So that's again, you need to have that direct connection to one of your domain controllers. NTLM authentication that we'll talk about a little bit later on is also no longer allowed for those kind of users, which by the way, should not be a breaking point. Another one that I like is the credentials cannot be delegated using constrained delegation. So that means, for example, when you allow a user to authenticate jumping to some application like SharePoint, you can use constrained delegation. If you have no idea what constrained delegation is about and you want to look into more details, I have a recommendation. Check out learn.microsoft.com for a lot more details, because it's also a bit depending on what kind of application you're running on top of your server. And then the last one that I'm going to highlight here for a second is that ticket granting ticket, or what we call the TGT, cannot renew past an initial lifetime. So again, we're not really focusing a lot on Active Directory in this course anymore, but since it's the baseline for a lot of what your Windows Server administration task will look like, the ticket granting means that when a user authenticates with Active Directory credentials, the user gets a ticket. I always describe this as like walking into, I don't know, some amusement park where you need a ticket to get in. Now on that ticket, it's going to validate like, are you an adult or are you a kid? Next to that, it's going to give you like, hey, you can walk in our amusement park on this specific day and you can no longer come back tomorrow unless you're going to get a new ticket, right? So that's, I know, like total simplification, but that's what we as trainers like to do, making complex things a lot easier for everyone to understand. And that's really what that ticketing is about. User authenticates, Active Directory Kerberos protocol gives you a ticket, and depending on so many settings in the platform, what kind of user, what kind of group membership, and obviously anything else that we talk about here could impact how long the credentials for the user or how long the ticket is actually valid. Once the ticket expires, the solution is like, I need to re-authenticate, and that's where the user can again pick up the correct permissions and performing certain tasks. So that's all about that protected user group. So what's the main message from here? If you have some of those more exclusive, specific, special accounts, maybe consider, instead of just granting them the permissions or the security settings out of the group policies, maybe think about moving them into that protected user group. Last couple of highlights here about that protected user group, where you can see that, for example, there's some minimal requirements about client and server operating system. Now, I would say, I hope at least that you're not really using those anymore as your day-to-day client or server operating system. If you still have them, obviously it's probably for a good reason, but I would also encourage you to maybe look into migrating to a more recent version, just because of like being legacy, being out of support, but it also highlights the minimum version that you need to keep all this working. So with that, I already talked about quite some security options, how to really configure some of the user account security. So I think it's more than important showing you, not only talking about it, but also showing you in a first demo here what some of these options actually look like. So in this demo, I'm going to show you a little bit on what it takes to configure user account rights, mainly using group policy settings, touching on security options for the individual user, and then touching on configuring password policies, and last closing with the protected user groups that I just talked about. So my starting point for the user account security demo here is obviously my Active Directory users and computers. So I do have a pretty traditional setup here in my demo to replicate a little bit what your real world scenario could look like. So I do have my domain, And underneath, I have an organizational unit for employees. And then underneath employees, I have a sub OU for my IT admins. And I also still have the traditional user groups. And within my employees, I have traditional users. So I got Mike, I got Lena, and I also have a marketing group. And then underneath IT admins, I do have Mike, one of my employees, but also having an admin account. And that's where we just want to replicate that the users should have admin permissions linked to a different account than the one they use for day-to-day tasks like checking email. One of the user account security options we have is probably password policies, and that means we need to shift to our group policy management. You can open this up by just going to the start menu, typing in gpmc.msc, and that's going to open up this console. Now, if I go into my default domain policy, I could actually open it up here. So right now, I'm in my default domain policy. I go into computer policies, account policies, password policy, and then underneath here, I can see that my domain for now has some policies where my password length should be 7 characters, needs to be 1 day old, and it cannot be more than 42 days old. So that's where we need to reset it. Pretty default, I didn't change anything. But now what we want to do is enforcing a more complex policy for my admin accounts. So the way to do that is creating a new policy. And that's my demo policy that I already created. Just gonna refresh this one here. Well, now if I look underneath my IT admins, got my demo GPO. And if I open this one up, diving into security settings, account policy, password policy, you're going to see that the password length here is now set to 10 characters, which means that I'm not okay if the password is below 10, although the default domain one is 7. So let's have a look what this means for our user account. Since the GPO is linked to the IT admins, I go into Mike admin, gonna reset the password, and I'm gonna try and use one that's less than 10 characters. So this is 9, and if I go ahead, it's like, okay, cool, we accept it. Now wait a minute, it got changed, but I'm forcing 10 characters, so something is not right. Well, now if I try something else, let's go back, we're gonna reset, and I'm just gonna use 4. It's gonna tell me like, well, this doesn't work because it's not meeting the password policy requirements. So what this means to me is that my default domain policy is the one that's winning. So how can we make sure that our admin accounts, or basically any account, it's not important that it's an admin, it's just linked to specific group membership. That's where now we go into our Active Directory Administrative Center. So these settings are not available from within the traditional user and computers. And we're going to search for password settings container. You can see where you can locate it. So on the top of your domain, you go into System and you find password settings container. You could also search for it from the homepage of the ADUC. What we're going to do here is creating a new password policy setting. And most of these settings are basically identical to what you have in traditional ADUC. So I'm going to call this the 12-character password because that's what I want. And precedence, it just asks for a number. So you can create different levels and different priorities. I'm going to allocate precedence 1. The lowest number gets the highest priority. And right now, I'm going to enforce the policy to have 12 characters. The big difference here is that it's not managed out of a group policy, but it's a direct allocation. So what this means is we can allocate this to our IT admins group. And I'm going to save it. And then from here, I go back to my mic admin. I'm going to try to reuse my password with only 9 characters. Similar as before. And now you can see that it's no longer getting accepted. Where if I do 12, I'm not going to bore you with this as part of the demo, but trust me, I tried it out. I've seen it in the field. And that's where we now have that password settings, or what we call fine-grained password policies. That could be the other term for the same concept. The other item we touched on is protected user groups. So what this means is underneath the traditional users location in our domain structure, we do have a group here called protected users, and you would just add users into it. So nothing's really different. It's just that additional protected group. And then on top of that, if you go into Event Viewer, there is specific monitoring for the protected user group as well. It's maybe a little bit hard to find it at first. So what you need to do is go into the applications and services, so not under the traditional system level here. Next, you dive into the Microsoft section, look for Windows, and from there, we jump into authentication, where you have protected user client. Any protected user, like a member of that protected user group, will show the Kerberos activity in the event viewer. That's pretty much it for this first demo, where I would like to invite you to join me for the rest of the presentation. Now, out of this demo, already showed you quite some security options for your user account protection, but there's actually even more. So we talked about the user account security, talked about the protection, talked about the protecting user group, but then also highlighting here a little bit of a closing and a segue to the next topic, if you want, that you can manage all that using authentication policies. So I mentioned group policies quite a lot, and I hope for all of you it makes sense that a lot of these configurations could be done on individual users, individual devices, but preferably try to move them all into group policies. Last little item I want to highlight here is that authentication policy as the setting, but then also the policy silo. Now, what is a silo? It means that you can create your group policies, protecting user settings out of them, and then from there pushing them to a specific client, or even allocating to a user, or obviously a combination of both. And when I talk about user, keep in mind that it could also be an application service account. So that was mainly the wrap up of the previous section, I would say. Next to that, we're going to touch a bit on different Defender scenarios, like Microsoft Defender running as part of the operating system, how it can actually enable you to protect your users. So the first service here that I want to highlight is Defender Credential Guard. We're still in this main section about protecting users, and what Defender Credential Guard is doing is literally protecting the credentials from the user. Now, if you look at this diagram here, what it actually means is that the specific credentials for the user accounts where you activate it for are now no longer just running like inside that operating system, but actually running in a dedicated virtual environment. It's still within the host, but it's relying on that hypervisor layer in between. Now, what it means is that your credentials running inside the user credentials running inside that credential guard configuration, it's like that dedicated little isolated environment that's going to allow the user credentials from being compromised, because they're really in that isolated little space within the client or within the server, and that means that they should not be reachable from like a malware solution. That's the main idea. Again, a few highlights here without reading everything from the slide, but again, you already know if you see any of those heavy text slides, feel free to pause the video just for a second. But in short, it means that Credential Guard has some operating system version dependencies. The one that I like to highlight here is obviously Windows 10 Enterprise or Windows Server 2016 Newer Edition. You already find out in my demos, I'm using Server 2025, which is the latest available version for now. But if you go like, well, we're not using it yet, we're using server 19 or server 16 still, which would be totally fine, then know that that's like the minimal version you need. Obviously, next to that, you need that hypervisor, CPU virtualization, and then obviously for the security part of it, also that trusted TPM chip, which means that it's going to be used for really encrypting those credentials. And then last, secure boot and secure firmware updates, I guess, are pretty obvious as well. Now, Defender Credential Guard also has a few other prerequisites, like if you have any of these specifics still active in your environment, first of all, know that some of these are considered a little bit less secure. I wouldn't like to emphasize like more weak security, but at the same time, a lot of these are a little bit more legacy or considered legacy in meantime. So you should try and maybe get away from them. But if you have them, it means that you cannot integrate Credential Guard, at least for those devices. And as you can imagine, after every couple of slides, when I talk about something, you can expect another little demo coming up. So in this specific demo, I'm going to walk you through a bit what Credential Guard in Defender is actually looking like. So we're going to start with enabling that virtualization-based security, enabling secure boot for as far as it's not already enabled, and then last, obviously, enabling Credential Guard from my initial demo machine, and then touching a bit on where in your group policy environment can you actually configure it, because again, it should not be done for just a single machine, but probably for most servers in your environment. So to enable our Defender Credential Guard, we're back in group policies. Now, there is also an option to do this from the registry, but I think in a real-world scenario, it's probably easier to do this from group policies. So out of the group policy management, we're going to create a new group policy object. I'm going to call this one the Credential Guard Demo GPO. And then I'm going to make some edits where the settings for Device Guard is inside Computer Configuration. Underneath, we jump into Policies. I'll make this a little bit bigger. And same here. We go into Administrative Templates inside System, and that's where up here we have Device Guard, and that's the setting we need. Now, there's two different ways to manage this, which means you can enable it or you cannot enable it. So we're going to open up our virtualized based security. And from here, right now it's not configured. That's typically the default for any kind of GPO we're going to add. So we switch to enabled. And from here, we have different options. And obviously, depending on the specifics of your environment, where you want to use this, on what kind of server platform you want to use this, you would probably switch those settings or maybe creating different group policies. If you want to use these on Hyper-V platforms, know that the Gen 2 is what you need for the UEV support and secure boot as well. The Gen 1 VMs won't give you that option. So in here, you would just change all the settings that you need. We're going to enable lock and then maybe the other Credential Guard config without lock, and then secure, we're going to enable it as well. Just an example, again, in your environment, it could be slightly different. But that's really how easy it is to configure. And then obviously, once you have your GPO in place, you're going to link it to the specifics in your environment. So if you want to move this to your domain controllers, then you could link your GPO here, where we're going to add Credential Guard, and that's pretty much all we have to do. So with that, let's move on with the presentation. Good. So with that, another little security optimization that you can enable in your environment. And I'm talking about enabling security, and that means we're going to disable some legacy authentication protocol. NTLM is the network NT4 version alike from like plus 20 years back. And that's what we used at that moment in time to allow users to authenticate. It's even from before Active Directory, if you want. So it's indeed more than 25 years old. Now, the NTLM authentication was always one of the ways to allow Windows clients and servers to communicate with each other. But in meantime, it's considered a little bit too legacy, I would say. And again, there might still be reasons why you have it enabled in your environment. But I would say, if possible, try to just block it. How can you block it? A lot of different options. The most recommended one, I would say, in a larger environment, or once you have a few more than just a handful of servers, is again back to our trusted group policy settings. 3 different settings you need to block here, like enabling the setting to block. So that's sometimes a little bit weird in the group policy settings. You don't need to enable, but you need to enable the blocking aspect of it. So what you need is in the network security section. So you go into computer configuration, all the way up in that left corner, Windows settings, security settings, that's where we are, local policies for the devices, and then within security options. You're going to block network security, restrict NTLM outgoing traffic. You're going to restrict audit incoming NTLM traffic so you can see what's happening in and out. And then last, also auditing any NTLM authentication, to just allowing you to identify like which of my clients and users are still relying on that NTLM protocol. And then once you have that auditing done, that's obviously the first start. I would say don't just block the authentication, because you might never know without auditing like which clients, which servers are still relying on it, and it might actually break your application. And that's where I would say start with the auditing. And once you have a pretty clear, pretty solid view on like we don't have any applications running anymore on NTLM authentication, then just go for the full blocking. That's the main message. Another security aspect is what we called at the start, those problematic accounts. Now, what is a problematic account? Now, it could be a lot of different ones. The most I would like to highlight here is inactive user accounts. Typically, first of all, make sure that if you don't need those user accounts anymore, for obviously administrative permissions, but also for any traditional user, if the user doesn't need to authenticate anymore, it's probably because the user left the organization or maybe switched to a different account. But then having that inactive user, it means that the user account is still there, but nobody's really using it anymore. So that could also point towards a little shortcoming in the process where somebody maybe failed to remove or disable the account. So those are problematic because they're still active, but nobody's using them. So probably the password policies are not 100% in sync. And that's also where you might have accounts with fixed passwords. Now, a fixed password is considered less secure because it means that those accounts are typically not really getting their password changed periodically, which could be causing problems on its own. And then some other is obviously having specific accounts that nobody really used anymore. They might already be inactive. Maybe they've been disabled for a while, but then the question is like, why should we keep them in the environment? And then also making sure that obviously you're going to go through this process, like I wouldn't say like once a year, but maybe like once a month. And if you want, or if you have a lot of like user mobility, then maybe even every couple of days. If you think about how to do this, I would say PowerShell might be a good way to think about this. Just pulling up a list of your Active Directory users and then specifically checking for some of those highlights in what we identified as problematic accounts. Next security topic is implementing exploit protection. Now, what this means is that by design, I could almost say that each and every client, any device, even mobile phones, tablets these days, they're under attack all the time. Obviously, not connecting devices to the internet if there's no need to, that would be a pretty good step. But at the same time, it's not just about having devices disconnecting from the internet. Why? Because all those devices on just a local network, whether it's cabled or wireless, they are vulnerable for those exploits. So what you can do is go into an operating system setting here that we call exploit protection, where you're going to enable some of those settings and really, I would say, optimizing the protection of your operating system layer. A little bit technical, but you can imagine I got a demo coming up on that part a little bit later on. One other defense mechanism to really protect your operating system is the Defender application control. So in short, what is application control? It's part of the operating system, Windows Defender, Microsoft Defender solutions. And what you're going to do here is explicitly identifying what can run on my server. And yes, it works for clients as well. So if you have a server with a dedicated task, could be a database server, could be a mail server, could be a web server, you can define explicitly like this kind of application, the database services, the file services, the web server services are okay to run on this server, but anything else should be blocked. So what it really means is on top of the Defender anti-malware protection, it's now also looking into the actual running processes. If there's a process like an application starting up, if it's not in that list or explicitly you're going to block it from running, that's dramatically moving up that protection mechanism. Since I talked about Defender already, I'm going to close with two other positionings of Defender capabilities, where obviously we also have Defender for endpoints. The good old, I would say, traditional anti-malware, but super powerful, allowing you to be managed from a centralized perspective. And it's really going to give you that additional level of protection on the operating system. Looking at suspicious activity, looking at suspicious files that somebody maybe tries to store into the server, that's mainly what we're talking about here. And then if your server has connectivity to the internet using a browser, at least just to be clear here, it's not checking anything on the network level, but Defender Smart Screen is a capability collection of settings you can enable, again, preferably out of group policies once more, where it allows you to really look into suspicious activity or suspicious behavior on a web page. So maybe taking a little step back here, if your server doesn't need internet connectivity, then obviously, first of all, make sure that the server cannot connect to the internet. Next to that, I don't always see why would an admin, like maybe yourself, using the browser on a server operating system. The recommendation here could actually be, instead of just enabling the Defender options that we talked about, maybe considering like if I need to download files, maybe I should download them from a different workstation, making sure that again, the protection mechanisms are in place and not even using the browser on the server instance itself. So with all that, I'm going to wrap up this section of the module where I'm going to walk you through the exploit protection, how to implement it, and then touching a bit on the three different Defender scenarios: application control, Defender for endpoint, and Defender Smart Screen. So this demo covers a couple of different Defender scenarios, where one of the first ones is that exploit protection, or as we have it in our group policies, Microsoft Defender Exploit Guard. So I'm back in the same demo GPO group policy object that I was in my previous demo, and we're going to dive in some additional settings here. So to find a spot, you go into Computer Configuration Policies, Administrative Templates, System, and then from there you scroll down, and one of the first options we have is back in Device Guard. The previous demo, we talked about the virtualization-based security, and now in the same spot, you find Defender Application Guard. Concept is the same. You're going to enable it, and from here, you're going to see that it's looking for a specific policy file. Now, this file can be stored in different places, and that's mainly what the explanation up here is trying to guide you. So store this in like a shared folder on the network. Could also be the local file, but then it means that it might not always be that practical from a group policy perspective. Now, the process itself, and I would say go into the documentation because there's so many different variations here. But what it could look like in your environment is in here bringing in like the user profile variable. And then inside the user profile, imagine we have a folder called security, and in there we have that policy P7B file. Now the P7B is basically an encrypted version of the original XML file that you need to create. And that's where I would recommend you go through the documentation, because it would take me a little bit too far off to just explain how you can enable this on your clients, and obviously in this case on servers as well. Another option you have, if you need some guidance on how to actually create those policies, is App Control Policy Wizard that you can reach from webapp-wdac-wizard.azurewebsites.net. Let me zoom in a little bit, and then you can freeze the video screen. But that's actually a free open source tool out of Microsoft, allowing you to create Microsoft App Control configuration settings using a somewhat easier interface. So just wanted to share that as well. Next option we talked about is our Defender for Endpoint. Now, again, not giving you all the details, but what we want to highlight is really what that Defender management looks like. So in this case, I'm in my security.microsoft.com management portal. I moved into my Defender, and then from there, I'm inside my endpoint section here. So Defender up here, and then underneath endpoints, I search for my Microsoft demo servers, at least the Active Directory server that I'm using for the moment. And that's mainly what you should do from here, like adding servers into it, managing servers from here, defining all your security settings. And then obviously you got the reporting, you got the versioning, and so much more, where you can see also that it's listing up that the security for my environment, my server, is not all the best. And that's where you can move into security recommendations. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of them. It's my demo environment, so I'm not too worried for it right now. But obviously, in a real world scenario, you would spend quite some time on actually going through all these settings. Last little setting we need to touch on a little bit is that smart screen. So that's the protection in the browser. And it's, again, possible to configure this through different mechanisms, but I still like group policies. They've been around for so long, and it's, I guess, still one of the easiest ways to manage all those configuration options for your clients and servers, no matter where they're running or who's using them. So inside our group policies, we're now diving into a subsection called Windows Components. And then from there, we have Microsoft Defender Exploit Guard as one of the options that I also talked about. And then a little bit more down, we have our Windows Defender Smart Screen. There's still Explorer in there, but I'm not going to show you because it's considered no longer supported, right? So let's do Microsoft Edge, where now you have two different settings: configure Defender Smart Screen and then preventing bypassing. And as you probably already know, you dive in, you enable it. You can interact with quite some options down here where you can be a little bit more specific. And then the prevent bypassing, I would definitely recommend that one to be enabled as well. So that's pretty much it for this part of the session and my demo covering a couple of different Defender security mechanisms.